I found out at 7:04 in the morning. Not from a confession. Not from some dramatic confrontation where she broke down and told me everything with tears running down her face. I found out because Emily left her phone on the bathroom counter while she was in the shower, and a message came through from a number saved under a name I didn't recognize, and the screen lit up just long enough for me to read 8 words that rearranged everything I thought I knew about my life. Last night was amazing. When can I see you again? My name is Ryan. I'm 34 years old, I work as a graphic designer for a mid-size agency downtown, and until that Saturday morning I had considered myself a reasonably perceptive person. Not paranoid, not insecure in any clinical sense, just aware. I paid attention to things. It was part of the job, noticing details, reading visual information that other people processed without quite seeing. I'd always believed that quality extended to the people close to me. I believed I would know, instinctively, if something was wrong. I was wrong about that. And the wrongness of it, the specific, humbling fact that the evidence had been accumulating for weeks while I'd been looking slightly to the left of it, was almost as disorienting as the message itself. Emily and I had been married for 7 years. We met in our late 20s at a friend's gallery opening, the kind of event where you stand around with wine and talk about things that feel important at the time. She was wearing a yellow dress and making a dry, quiet joke to someone beside her, and I remember thinking she was the kind of person who was funny without needing anyone to notice. That quality had attracted me immediately. Over 7 years it had become part of the furniture of my life, reliable, familiar, taken entirely for granted in the way you take for granted the things you rely on most. We didn't have children. We'd discussed it, circled the subject without landing anywhere definitive. Emily said she wasn't ready. I said I wasn't either. We told ourselves we had time, which is the thing people say when they're more comfortable with the postponement than they'd like to admit. The night before the message, the night that everything in this story actually began, though I didn't understand that until morning, Emily had gone to a party at Amanda's. Amanda was Emily's best friend. Had been since college, 12 years of the particular closeness that forms between women who've seen each other through everything, breakups, career changes, the slow accumulation of adult life. I'd always liked Amanda in the way you like someone you've spent enough time around to feel comfortable with but have never quite fully known. She was warm and easy, the kind of person who filled a room without dominating it. I had no particular reason to distrust her. That would change. Emily had mentioned the party on a Wednesday, casually, in the middle of a conversation about something else, the way you mention things you want to minimize. Amanda was having people over Saturday night, she said. Just a small gathering. She wanted to go. I said fine. Of course. Go. What I didn't say, what I registered and filed and didn't examine, was the feeling that had accompanied that brief conversation. A small tightening, low and unremarkable, the body's version of a question the mind hasn't quite formulated yet. I'd felt it and dismissed it as the general low-grade anxiety of a man who worked too many hours and slept too little. By Saturday morning, standing in my bathroom with a lit phone screen and 8 words I couldn't unread, I understood that the feeling had known something I hadn't been willing to know. The week before the party had the texture of a week I would later examine with the particular attention of someone reconstructing an accident, looking for the moment the road curved, the moment the conditions changed, the moment a different choice might have produced a different outcome. Emily and I had a routine. 7 years of marriage produces its own grammar, the unspoken agreements about who makes coffee and who locks up at night, the comfortable silences that don't require filling, the shorthand of people who have spent enough time together that language becomes partially optional. I'd valued that grammar. I'd thought of it as evidence of something solid. What I hadn't considered was that a grammar can become a cage without either person noticing. That the shorthand can start to substitute for the actual conversation. That comfortable silence and meaningful silence are not the same thing, and that I've been confusing them for longer than I wanted to admit. In the weeks before the party, Emily had been slightly elsewhere. Not dramatically, nothing that would have registered to a casual observer, but elsewhere in the way I was beginning, in retrospect, to recognize. She was present in the house but oriented towards something outside it. Her phone had become a more frequent presence in her hand, which I'd noticed without comment. She laughed more easily at things I hadn't said, which I'd noticed and told myself was simply a good mood. I told myself a lot of things that week. Thursday evening, 2 days before the party, I came home from work to find Emily at the kitchen counter in the particular configuration I associated with her getting ready to go somewhere, not dressed yet, but already arranged, her hair done, a purposefulness in her posture that preceded effort. I asked where she was going. She said nowhere, just freshening up. She'd been home all day, she was just tired of feeling stale. It was plausible. It was the kind of thing she might have said on any ordinary Thursday. I put my bag down and opened the refrigerator and took it at face value, because taking things at face value had always been my default, not naivety, I'd have told you, but trust. The kind you build over years and then stop rebuilding because you assume it maintains itself. Friday night she was on her phone more than usual. We were watching television, a show we'd been working through together, one of those serialized dramas that requires enough attention to make conversation difficult, and twice in one episode she picked up her phone and read something and set it back down with the expression I would later catalog as the expression of someone managing information they're choosing not to share. Not guilt, exactly. Discretion. The face of a person keeping something in a separate compartment. I noticed it. I said nothing. I watched the television and told myself I was reading too much into nothing. Saturday arrived in the way that days do when something important is going to happen in them, looking exactly like any other day. I made breakfast. Emily came downstairs in pajamas and ate toast and talked about the show we'd been watching, about a scene from the previous night that she'd found funny. She was easy and warm and entirely herself, or what I had, for 7 years, understood as entirely herself. Around noon she mentioned the party. That evening, she said. She thought she'd leave around 8. She wasn't sure what time she'd be back. Amanda's things tended to run late, and she didn't want to commit to a time and then feel pressured to leave early. I said that was fine. I meant it. Or I meant the surface of it. Underneath the surface, the tightening I'd felt on Wednesday was back, slightly more defined, a question taking shape without quite arriving at language. The dress she chose was the first thing that registered clearly enough to stay registered. Emily had a relationship with clothes that was practical rather than performative. She dressed well but without particular effort, which I'd always found appealing, the quality of someone who had taste without needing to display it. The dress she put on Saturday evening was different. It was one she rarely wore, a dark burgundy thing, fitted, the kind that required intention. She stood in front of the mirror in the bedroom for longer than usual, assessing herself with a critical attention I associated with occasions that mattered. I was sitting on the bed reading when she turned and asked how she looked. Beautiful, I said. And she was. But the word sat in my mouth slightly awkwardly, because what I actually wanted to ask was, for what? For Amanda's. For a small gathering of people she'd known for years. For a Friday night that she'd described in deliberately casual terms. I didn't ask. I told myself I was being the controlling kind of husband I'd always made a point not to be, and I went back to my book, and Emily kissed my cheek and said don't wait up, and the front door closed, and I was alone in the house with a feeling I couldn't name and was trying hard not to examine. She texted at 9:15. Here. Amanda's made some incredible sangria. Don't wait up XO. I read it and set my phone down and watched television for an hour and went to bed. I didn't sleep well. I wouldn't have been able to say why. I woke at 2 in the morning to a quiet house. This was the first fact that registered, quiet. No door, no keys, no footsteps on the stairs. Emily hadn't come home. I lay in the dark and processed this for a moment and reached for my phone. No messages since the 9:15 text. I sent one, hey, still at Amanda's. 3 dots appeared. Disappeared. Did not reappear. I put the phone on the nightstand and stared at the ceiling and told myself she was fine, that she'd said not to wait up, that Amanda's gatherings ran late, that there was no reason to be the husband who panicked because his wife stayed out past midnight. I told myself all of this with the deliberate patience of someone talking themselves off a ledge. At 2:47 I sent another message. Just checking in. Let me know you're okay. Nothing. By 3:30 I had moved to the living room, which felt slightly more manageable than the bedroom for reasons I couldn't articulate. I sat on the sofa in the dark and went through the specific logic of a person trying to construct a rational explanation. She'd had too much sangria and Amanda had told her to stay, her phone was dead, she'd fallen asleep on Amanda's couch and not seen my messages. All of these were possible. All of these were the kind of thing that happened. I called her at 3:45. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. Her voice, familiar and warm, asking me to leave a message. I didn't leave one. I called Amanda. This was the decision I would later question most, not because it was wrong, but because of what it revealed. Amanda answered after 3 rings, her voice carrying the particular softness of someone pulled from the edge of sleep, and I said I was sorry to call so late, I just hadn't heard from Emily and wanted to make sure she was okay. A pause. Brief, but there. She's fine, Amanda said. Yeah, she's here. She had a lot to drink, she's sleeping it off. I should have texted you, I'm sorry. Can I talk to her? Another pause. Slightly longer. She's really out, Ryan. I don't want to wake her. She'll call you in the morning, okay? She's totally fine. I said okay. I thanked her. I hung up. I sat in the living room for another hour and turned Amanda's 2 pauses over and over. They could mean anything. People paused. People were half asleep at 3:45 in the morning and took a moment to locate their thoughts. The explanation she'd given was plausible. Emily had drunk too much, she was sleeping it off, Amanda had forgotten to text. These things happened. But something in the quality of those pauses, the specific tenor of a hesitation that wasn't quite searching for words so much as selecting them, had settled in me like a splinter. Not painful yet. Just present. I went back to bed at 5. I did not sleep. At 6:30 I heard the front door. I lay still and listened to the sounds of Emily coming in, keys, the soft click of the door, footsteps in the hallway, the particular sequence of sounds I'd heard hundreds of times before but was hearing now with an attention I'd never previously applied. She moved quietly. Trying not to wake me. That in itself was not unusual, she'd always been considerate about coming in late. But there was a quality to the movement that I registered without being able to define, the carefulness of someone managing something, not just consideration for a sleeping husband. She went to the bathroom. I heard the shower. At this point I was still telling myself a coherent story. She'd drunk too much at Amanda's, she'd slept on Amanda's couch, she'd come home and was showering before coming to bed. This was a reasonable story. I held it carefully and waited. The phone was on the bathroom counter. I wasn't looking for anything. I want to be precise about that, I was not in the bathroom to search her phone. I went in to get aspirin from the cabinet, the headache from a sleepless night finally demanding attention, and the phone was there on the counter next to the sink, screen up for once, and it lit up with the notification at exactly the moment I was standing in front of it. Last night was amazing. When can I see you again? The name above the message, Zach. I didn't know a Zach. In 7 years of marriage, in the full catalogue of names I'd accumulated from Emily's stories and social circles and the peripheral population of her life, there was no Zach. The name didn't belong to any context I could locate. I stood in the bathroom with aspirin in my hand and a sound in my ears that might have been the shower or might have been something internal, some frequency the brain produces when the ground shifts under it, and I understood with the cold clarity of a fact that has been waiting to be acknowledged that the story I'd been telling myself for the past several hours was not the true story. The shower was still running. I had perhaps 4 minutes. I picked up the phone. The phone wasn't locked. That detail registered distantly, the way you notice small things in moments of shock, the peripheral information the mind files automatically while the central processing is occupied with something else. No lock screen. Emily had never been a person who locked her phone, had always found the extra step irritating, and apparently that habit hadn't changed even when the content of the phone had become something that warranted protection. Or perhaps she simply hadn't thought about it. Perhaps in the logistics of whatever the previous night had been, phone security had not made the list. I found Zach's contact in under 30 seconds. The message thread was brief, they hadn't communicated much through this channel, or the history had been deleted, because what remained was only the last several exchanges. The most recent, his message that had just come through, and above it, from last night at 11:47 p.m., a message from Emily, just got here. Miss you already. Just got here. Somewhere. Not Amanda's. I scrolled up. The thread above that was sparse, a few messages from the previous 2 weeks that were warm in the specific way of people in the early stages of something, the careful warmth of new intimacy that hasn't yet settled into ease. I read them quickly, committing what I could to memory, aware that I had a limited window. Then I went to Amanda. The thread with Amanda was longer and more recent, and what I found there was worse in a different way, not more damning, but more deliberate. 3 days before the party, Amanda had written, "He's going to ask where you were. Just say my place all night. I'll back you up. Emily, you're sure? Amanda, don't worry. He won't find out." I stood in the bathroom and read that exchange twice. The shower was still running. I could hear Emily moving behind the curtain, the ordinary sounds of someone washing their hair, entirely unaware that 12 feet away the architecture of her lie was being read by the person it was built to deceive. He won't find out. The specific confidence of that sentence. The certainty in it. The way it casually assigned me a role, the one who wouldn't find out, that I had apparently been playing for longer than just last night, because Amanda's message 3 days before the party suggested this wasn't the first time she'd been called on to provide cover. He's going to ask where you were. She'd anticipated my question because she'd answered it before. I put the phone back exactly where I'd found it. I went to the kitchen. I sat down at the table and placed both hands flat on the surface and breathed very slowly for what might have been 2 minutes or 10. The aspirin was still in my hand. I swallowed it dry. What I did next was something I've turned over many times since, trying to decide how I feel about it. I went back to my phone, my own phone, on the nightstand, and I opened the location history app we'd set up together 2 years ago after Emily's car had broken down and she'd been in an unfamiliar part of the city. A mutual safety measure. She knew it existed. I'd never had occasion to look at it before. I looked at it now. The timeline from the previous evening was clear. Emily had left our house at 8:12. She'd been at Amanda's by 8:45, that was accurate, at least that part was real. She'd left Amanda's at 11:31. The next location pin was 4 miles east, at an address I didn't recognize, which I cross-referenced immediately with my Maps app. A hotel. A mid-range place near the convention center, the kind of anonymous, comfortable establishment that doesn't attract attention or ask questions. She'd been there from 11:43 p.m. to 6:09 a.m. 6 hours and 26 minutes. I sat with that number. 6 hours and 26 minutes in a hotel 4 miles from our house while I was lying awake in the dark calling her phone and calling Amanda and constructing patient, reasonable explanations for an absence that had a much simpler explanation. The shower shut off. I heard the curtain rings on the rod, the sound of a towel, movement. I went back to the kitchen and made coffee with hands that were steadier than I would have expected, the steadiness of someone who has moved past panic into something colder and more functional. Emily came downstairs 20 minutes later. She was dressed, not in the burgundy dress, which I registered immediately. She'd changed into jeans and a soft shirt, a change of clothes she must have brought in her bag. Her hair was damp and she looked tired but composed, the specific composure of someone who has prepared for this moment. "Morning," she said. "You're up early." "Couldn't sleep," I said. Technically true. She poured coffee and leaned against the counter and looked at me with an expression I was now reading differently than I would have 24 hours ago, the warmth in it still recognizable, but visible to me now as something performed alongside something else, the way a painting has an underpainting you can sometimes see when the light hits it right. "How was last night?" I asked. "Good." She wrapped both hands around the mug. "Amanda made sangria. We stayed up way too late. I probably should have texted you more, sorry about that." "It's fine," I said. I watched her. She held my gaze easily, no flicker of anything, and I understood that she was good at this, better than I'd known, which was its own revelation. 7 years of marriage and I hadn't known she could do this. Hadn't known there was a version of her that could stand in our kitchen the morning after a night in a hotel with another man and look at me with that specific, practiced ease. I didn't confront her then. I want to explain why, because I've questioned that decision many times. I didn't confront her because I wasn't ready. Not emotionally, I'd moved past emotional readiness into something more functional, but strategically, in a way that surprised me. Some clear, cold part of my mind understood that a confrontation in that moment, with only what I had, would allow her to manage the narrative. She'd had time to prepare, she'd been preparing since before she left the house the night before, probably, and I had had 45 minutes. I needed more time. Not more evidence, exactly. I had enough of that. But more time to understand what I was going to do with it. So I drank my coffee and I asked about Amanda's sangria and I listened to Emily describe a party she'd partially attended, filling in the details she'd been there for with the fluency of someone who'd done this before, and I nodded in the right places and kept my face as neutral as I could manage, and inside I was doing an entirely different kind of accounting. I texted Derek. Derek was an acquaintance, the peripheral kind, someone I knew through a mutual friend who had apparently been at Amanda's the previous night. I'd seen his name in a group message Emily had been added to earlier in the week about the party. I sent him a casual message, "Hey, were you at Amanda's last night? Emily mentioned you might be there." His response came 40 minutes later, while Emily was upstairs, "Yeah, for a while. Good time. Though Emily left pretty early I think, maybe around 11. Amanda might know." I read that twice. Saved the screenshot. She left around 11. The location history said 11:31. Derek's estimate was close enough to be credible. Which meant that whatever story Emily was preparing to tell me about staying at Amanda's all night, the story Amanda had rehearsed with her 3 days in advance, was contradicted by someone who'd been there and had no reason to lie. I had the phone message. I had the location history. I had Derek's text. I had Amanda's message, "He won't find out." I sat in my study with the door closed and looked at all of it on my phone and understood that the question was no longer what had happened. The question was what I was going to do about it, and how, and when. I decided on the morning. The same morning. I didn't want to carry this through another ordinary day, couldn't have managed the performance for that long, and there was something in me, something that had solidified in the past 2 hours from shock into a harder, quieter resolve, that was done waiting. I went upstairs and found Emily sitting on the bed scrolling through her phone. She looked up when I came in and smiled, the easy smile of a Saturday morning at home, and I stood in the doorway and felt the last remnant of doubt dissolve, not because I needed it to dissolve, the evidence was already sufficient, but because her face in that moment was so entirely composed that I understood the composure itself as a kind of final confirmation. Real innocence doesn't need to be managed. What I was looking at was managed. "Can we talk?" I said. Something shifted in her expression. The faintest reorganization, quick, almost invisible, but there. "Sure," she said. "What's up?" I sat down in the chair across from the bed. I set my phone on the arm of the chair where she could see the screen if I turned it toward her. And I began. "I want to ask you something," I said, "and I want you to think carefully before you answer." Emily set her phone face down on the bed. That gesture, the automatic, by now reflexive phone flipping, registered as the last unconscious honesty she'd show me for a while. "Okay," she said. Her voice was even. Careful. How was the party? Ryan, I know you already told me. I'm asking again. A beat. It was good. I told you. Amanda's sangria, too late, tired this morning. What is this? What time did you leave? The reorganization in her face was more visible this time. She was calculating, I could see it, the way you can see the load on a structure if you know what stress looks like. I don't know. Late. 2-ish, maybe. I honestly wasn't tracking the time. Derek says you left around 11. Silence. Not a dramatic silence, not the silence of someone caught and falling apart. A particular, controlled silence. The silence of someone buying seconds. Her eyes moved to my phone on the arm of the chair, and I watched her assess whether I had something on the screen or whether Derek's text was the extent of it. I turned the phone toward her. The location history was open. The timeline. 11:31 at Amanda's. 11:43 at the hotel. 6:09 a.m. departure. She looked at it for a long moment. Her face was doing something complicated that I watched without being able to fully catalog: recognition, calculation, and underneath both of those something that might have been relief, the specific relief of someone who has been managing a weight for a long time and can see the moment when they'll be able to put it down. Ryan. I also read Zach's message this morning, I said. When you were in the shower. The relief, if that's what it had been, contracted. She closed her eyes briefly. And Amanda's, I added. From 3 days ago. He won't find out. That one specifically. She opened her eyes. She looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen on her face before, not in 7 years, not in any argument or difficult conversation we'd had. It was the face of someone stripped of their prepared version of events and standing in the unmanaged truth of a thing, and it was both less and more than I'd expected. Less theatrical. More real. How long? I asked. She was quiet for a moment. Then, about 6 weeks. 6 weeks. I absorbed that. It was both shorter and longer than I'd been unconsciously calculating, shorter in timeline, longer in the sense that 6 weeks meant the Wednesday feeling, the Thursday counter, the Friday phone, all of it had been happening against the backdrop of something that had already been real for over a month. Who is he? Someone I met through work. A client. She said it flatly, without embellishment, which I found I preferred to an explanation that tried to contextualize it. And Amanda knew the whole time. Not the whole time. The last few weeks. Long enough to tell you I wouldn't find out. She flinched at that. Slightly, but visibly. She shouldn't have said that. She was trying to help me, which I know sounds. It sounds exactly like what it is, I said. Emily looked at her hands. She was sitting very still on the edge of the bed, her damp hair tucked behind her ears, and for a long moment neither of us said anything. I could hear the neighborhood outside, a lawn mower somewhere, a dog, the ordinary sounds of a Saturday morning proceeding entirely without reference to the fact that everything in this room had changed. It was a mistake, she said finally. The first version of the sentence people reach for, I'd learn, when the fuller version requires more honesty than they're ready for. 6 weeks is not a mistake, I said. A mistake is one night you regret. 6 weeks is a decision you made repeatedly. She didn't argue with that. I respected her for not arguing with that. What followed was an hour of the hardest conversation I've ever had, not hard in the sense of shouting, because neither of us raised our voices, but hard in the way of a reckoning, a thing that requires you to look at what's been true without the filter of what you'd prefer. Emily talked. I listened. She told me about Zach, not in detail, not in a way that tried to explain or contextualize the attraction, but honestly, in the way of someone who has decided that honesty is the only remaining currency that means anything. She told me things about the marriage that I hadn't wanted to hear and had therefore not asked about. That she'd felt invisible for longer than she'd realized. That the routine we'd built, the comfortable grammar I'd valued, had become, for her, a kind of slow suffocation. That she'd tried to say this, in indirect ways, in the ways people try to say difficult things without saying them plainly, and I hadn't heard her. Or I had heard and not responded, which she admitted was not entirely my fault. She hadn't been direct, had expected me to read signals I hadn't been equipped to read. I heard this. I tried to hear it without defensiveness, which was difficult. There was a part of me that wanted to contest it, to point to evidence of my presence and attentiveness, to argue that if she'd felt invisible she should have said so plainly rather than resolving the problem by spending 6 weeks in another man's company. That part was not wrong, exactly. But it wasn't the whole picture either, and I knew it, and sitting in that chair across from my wife I understood for the first time, with clarity rather than comfort, that a marriage is not a structure one person maintains while the other occupies. We had both been coasting. She had found a more destructive exit from the coast than I had. That understanding didn't change my decision. But it complicated my grief, which I think was important. It meant I couldn't grieve cleanly, couldn't position myself as the simple victim of an uncomplicated wrong. The wrong was real. The complication was also real. Both of those things were true in the same space, and I had to hold them both. I want you to leave, I said. Today. You can figure out where, Amanda's, a hotel, wherever. But I need you out of this house today. She looked up. Ryan. I'm not doing this as punishment, I said. I'm not trying to hurt you. But I can't be in this house with you right now, and it's my house too, so I need you to go. She nodded. She didn't cry. I'd expected tears, had half-steeled myself for them, and their absence was both a relief and its own small revelation. Emily's composure in crisis was something I was seeing clearly for the first time, and I understood that I had probably underestimated it throughout our marriage, in ways that had consequences I couldn't fully trace. She packed a bag. I sat in the kitchen and listened to her move through the house, the specific sounds of a person extracting themselves from a life they'd been embedded in, and I drank cold coffee and looked at the table and thought about nothing in particular, which was its own kind of processing. Before she left she stood in the kitchen doorway with her bag and said, "I'm sorry, Ryan. I don't expect that to fix anything." "It doesn't," I said. "But thank you." She left. The front door closed with its familiar sound, and the house settled into a silence that was the same silence as every other morning and entirely, irrevocably different. I sat at the table for a long time. Then I got up and washed both coffee cups, dried them, put them in the cabinet, and went to the window and looked at the street. The lawn mower was still going somewhere. The dog was still barking intermittently. The world was continuing without reference to any of this, which was both the most ordinary and the most useful thing I could have observed in that moment. The weeks after Emily left had a quality I hadn't anticipated. They were quiet in a way that wasn't unpleasant. I'd expected devastation. I'd expected the kind of acute, disabling grief that I'd read about and seen in other people, the inability to eat or sleep, the intrusive thought loops, the walking into rooms and forgetting why. Some of that came. But it was less total than I'd feared, and I spent time trying to understand why, which led me to an uncomfortable conclusion. I had been somewhat alone in the marriage for longer than I'd admitted to myself. The quality of the house without Emily was different from what I'd expected because it wasn't entirely new. Quieter, yes. But not as different as it should have been if we'd truly been as present to each other as I'd believed. That was the hardest thing to sit with. Not her betrayal, the betrayal was clean in its way, a clear wrong with a clear shape that I could name and hold. What was harder was the inventory of the marriage itself, the honest accounting of what we'd been to each other in the years before Zach and the hotel and Amanda's carefully planned lie. I was not a perfect husband. I had not been consistently present, had not asked the right questions, had built comfort in the place where curiosity should have lived. None of that made what she did acceptable. But it meant I couldn't grieve from a position of pure innocence, and pure innocence would have been easier. I called Amanda once, about 2 weeks after. It was not a conversation I'd planned. I was driving home from work and her name came up on my phone and I answered before I'd decided whether to. She was quiet for a long moment when she realized I was calling her directly, and then she started to say something about being sorry, about having been in an impossible position, about loyalties. I interrupted her. Not unkindly, but clearly. The message you sent her, I said. 3 days before the party. He won't find out. I want to know, when you wrote that, did you think about me at all? A long silence. Ryan, Not asking for an apology, I said. Just asking if I was in the calculation at all. She didn't answer the question directly, which was itself an answer. She said she'd been trying to protect her friend. I said I understood that. I said loyalty to a friend didn't require lying to that friend's husband, and that there was a difference between privacy and complicity. She said she knew that. She sounded like she did know it. It didn't change what had happened, but the conversation resolved something for me, not about Amanda, but about what I expected from people who were adjacent to my life. I'd expected too little. I'd operated with a generosity of assumption that left no room for the possibility that people close to someone I loved might not have my interests anywhere near their consideration. Emily called 3 times in the first month. I let the first 2 go to voicemail. The third I answered, because ignoring calls forever felt like a performance of something I wasn't actually feeling. I wasn't angry anymore, or not primarily. The anger had been real and had done its necessary work in the weeks immediately after, but it had burned down to something lower and more settled. She said she was staying with a friend from work. She said she'd been thinking about what she wanted. She asked, carefully, whether there was any version of a conversation we could have about what came next. I told her I didn't know. That was honest. I wasn't ready to decide whether the marriage was completely over or whether some other configuration of it was possible, and I wasn't going to reach a decision before I'd arrived at one naturally. I'd spent too much of the marriage deciding things before I was ready because readiness made me anxious. She said she understood. We agreed to talk more when I was ready. She didn't push. That restraint, the absence of pressure, the willingness to wait, was more than I'd expected, and I filed it away in the revised picture I was building of who Emily actually was, as distinct from who I'd assumed her to be for 7 years. I didn't make any decisions that day. I drove home afterward and sat in the driveway for a while, the way I'd been doing with difficult things, sitting with them, not rushing to categorize or resolve. The house was quiet when I went in. I made dinner. I ate it at the kitchen table and looked out the window at the street where the evening light was doing something particular to the leaves on the oak tree we'd planted together 5 years ago, a Saturday in October, both of us sweaty and pleased with the impractical domesticity of it. The tree was larger than I remembered. You don't notice growth when you're watching something every day. I don't know, yet, what happens next. That's an honest answer. The marriage might reconstitute in some different form. It might not. What I know is that whatever comes next will be built on a different kind of attention than what came before, mine as much as hers, probably more than I'd like to admit. The man who sat in a living room at 3 in the morning telling himself patient, reasonable stories about a wife who was 4 miles away in a hotel, that man was not without fault. He was trying to protect something by refusing to test it, and what he was actually doing was allowing it to hollow out while he maintained the surface. I don't want to live on surfaces anymore. That's the clearest thing I came out of this with. Everything else is still being determined. The oak tree outside needs trimming. I'm going to do that this weekend. It's a start. Amanda wrote 3 words that she thought were a favor, he won't find out, and in those 3 words she revealed more about the architecture of this betrayal than anything Emily actually did. Because the message wasn't just cover. It was a plan. And plans require the person being deceived to be assigned a fixed, predictable role, in this case, the husband who could be managed, who would ask the expected questions and accept the expected answers and go back to the expected life without looking too hard at the seams. Ryan had been assigned that role without knowing it, and for a long time he'd been playing it with a kind of unconscious faithfulness that had made the deception easier than it should have been. That's the more uncomfortable truth this story carries: betrayal rarely succeeds without some cooperation from the person being betrayed. Not moral cooperation, Ryan did nothing wrong, but the cooperation of someone who has stopped asking the questions that might make comfort impossible. He'd built a marriage on assumption rather than inquiry, on familiarity rather than curiosity, and in doing so he'd created conditions that a person with Emily's particular combination of unspoken need and available exit was eventually going to find a way through. Emily's motivation, when you follow it back far enough, wasn't Zach. Zach was the solution she found to a problem she'd never named out loud. The problem was a marriage that had become, over 7 years, a shared routine rather than a shared life. She wasn't looking for someone exciting when she met Zach. She was looking, probably without quite knowing it, for the experience of being seen, and she found it in a place and a way that she will spend a long time reckoning with. What she did was wrong. But it grew in soil that both she and Ryan had tended. The role of Amanda deserves its own examination, because she represents something that doesn't always get named in these stories: the friend who enables not out of malice but out of a loyalty so complete it crowds out any other consideration. Amanda didn't dislike Ryan. She probably thought of herself as a good person acting in service of a complicated situation. What she did was give Emily permission, and permission, when given by someone we trust, has a way of removing the last obstacle between an impulse and an action. The message 3 days before the party was not just practical logistics. It was an absolution. And absolutions offered in advance have consequences the giver rarely anticipates. What Ryan discovered, in the months after the confrontation, was that the end of a version of yourself can be the beginning of a more accurate one. The man who told himself patient stories at 3 in the morning was trying to protect a marriage. The man who washed 2 cups and put them in the cabinet and looked out the window at a continuing world was someone who had decided, quietly and without drama, that protection built on willful not knowing wasn't protection at all. That distinction, between a marriage maintained through avoidance and one that actually holds weight, is perhaps the real subject of everything that happened. Whether Emily and Ryan rebuild something is, genuinely, unresolved. What isn't unresolved is the question of who they'd have to be to do it honestly. Both of them know the answer to that now. They didn't before. That knowledge, however painful the process of arriving at it, is worth something. Not everything. But something. The last thing worth saying is this: Ryan found out at 7:04 in the morning because Emily left her phone on the bathroom counter. A habit she'd never bothered to change because the person she was hiding from had never given her reason to think he'd look. Trust, weaponized by assumption, becomes its own kind of blindness. And blindness, however comfortable, is never protection, it's simply darkness with a better story attached. What I keep returning to, after sitting with this story, is something small. Not the hotel, not the messages, not even Amanda's 3 words. It's the dress. The dark burgundy dress that Emily chose carefully for a party she partly attended, standing in front of the mirror longer than usual, asking Ryan how she looked. And Ryan said beautiful, and meant it, and didn't ask the follow-up question that was sitting right there. For whom? For what, exactly? That unanswered question is where everything lives. We talk about betrayal as if it arrives suddenly, but it rarely does. It finds the spaces we've stopped looking into. And those spaces, the questions we don't ask because we're afraid of the answers, the mirrors we don't look into because we prefer the reflection we've decided on, those are always, always our own.